Hi, it's Christine Daigle.
J. Kevin Tumlinson.
Dick Wybrow.
And I'm JD Barker. Welcome to Writers Inc. So yeah, Jenna is out. We called Dick to brought him in basically off the bench to fill in. So how are things down in New Zealand, or up in New Zealand, over in New Zealand?
Down and farther down. We are down under. So that's way off. In fact, we are so off the map that we actually, if you take a look, you can even Google this for fun, because why wouldn't you? How many times New Zealand gets left off maps and globes? It's the thing here. We are ignored all the time.
Really?
The time. Yeah.
That's funny. You're the Gen X of the globe.
To be honest with you, I didn't know it was a real place. I thought it was like Middle Earth.
It is a bit fantastical. I would admit to that. But no, it's we're sort of in the heart of winter here, and this part of New Zealand, which it just means rain. It just rains all the time, constantly. So it's lovely. Yeah. We spend a lot of time inside, ignoring people.
I still prefer Old Zealand.
I'm just picturing these maps. Is it just like you just insert a sheep and put an arrow down where it should be?
Just not there. Like we don't exist. Like we're in another dimension or something. But yeah, no, we're fine with it. We do prefer it that way, because then people don't come here, because we like to keep it to ourselves.
Yeah.
So I jumped in and kind of interrupted you guys. Kevin, what were you talking about with this guy on Zoom?
Oh, the guy on Zoom. Yeah, no, this was okay. So his name is Corey Harris. I'm going to get the timeline all mixed up here, but I think it was like a couple of weeks ago, this whole video went viral where he was appearing via Zoom in court over driving. I think the charge was that he had been driving on a suspended license. And so he's driving a car on Zoom while he's talking to the judge, and the judge is understandably confused by this, and then basically sentences him, says, takes back whatever leeway the guy had, and said, you're going to have to report to jail tonight, 6:00. And the guy just is like, very disturbed by the fact that he was that dumb. Well, the media exploded over this, of course. The whole video went viral. People are making fun of him. Well, a couple of days later, the story releases that he was supposed to have his license reinstated like 2 years ago. And so everyone is very embarrassed. Mea culpas everywhere. They do all these retraction stories. And now it's all about supporting him because he's getting a raw deal. And then 2 days later, it comes out that he's never had a driver's license ever at all. No license in his life in any state, including Michigan. And so now he's back in jail. And he's actually in jail over a bench warrant from 2022 that is unrelated to all of it.
Sounds like an excellent reference on your resume.
There you go. That's a great story.
Pro tip.
Yeah.
Don't drive on Zoom while you're speaking to a judge.
I mean, that was dumb enough.
It's just never a good idea.
So he was just driving and like holding his phone in front of him while he's got the other hand on the wheel, like that kind of thing.
It seemed he probably had it in a some sort of holder, where it gets him. So he wasn't. At least his hands were on the wheel. But
oh, good, okay, safety stuff.
Now the big story, the whole thing was that he was taking his wife to the doctor because she wasn't well, or he was going to pick her up or something. He was pulling into the doctor's office when he called. So that made that story much more sympathetic. But once you found out that he doesn't even have a license. He's never had a license.
And he's probably not married.
I think he's married. He made a big deal about being a part of the church. And, there's a lot of this. And he was talking about how embarrassed he was and how this was, he didn't get like angry, outraged, but he was like very adamant that there were circumstances that people didn't know about.
There always are.
So, but what's been funny to me, the part that's funny to me, has been watching the media trip all over themselves like Three Stooges style, first to be the first to run this story, make their funny comments, and then just completely embarrassed and chagrined because they made fun of this guy who didn't deserve it. And now what do? Like, we're back to this guy being a moron, and now the media doesn't know what to do. That's the part that's cracking me up. So I'm watching the media.
I was in television for 20 years. That's
Yeah.
beautiful though for that, because you run the first story and then you get all the headlines, and then you run the second story that gets you all the attention in the
Yeah.
headlines, and then you get to write on. I mean, the guy just keeps
Yeah,
on
yeah.
giving, and he'll probably get a
His
YouTube
own
channel
Netflix
out of
show.
this too,
Yeah,
right?
maybe. That's what
Oh,
I was
yeah.
thinking. Like, how would I cash in on this fame? But yeah, he's like the giving tree of
He
media.
could give out legal advice on the road. He could give legal advice to people while he's driving everywhere.
Yeah.
This is not legal advice, by the way.
Yeah. Don't do any of this.
The press has changed so much. Like back in the 90s when I worked for newspapers, like you had to like get a credible source, like at least two, before you could
Yeah.
print pretty much anything. And nowadays, like that's completely out the window. Like they hear whatever and they are just trying to beat each
Yeah.
other to the mic or the camera to get the story out there, and then doing all their fact checking after the fact. And it's
Yeah. Well, what really got me was the shaming, because these are the people who were just making fun of the guy, and then 2 days later they're like, this is a hard lesson for all of you that you shouldn't judge people before you know all the facts, and then we're swinging
Right.
back around the other side. This is a really fun pendulum we're watching. So
we're gonna learn the guy drives a school bus during the daytime.
I am waiting for the next update.
Man, all right. What's going on in the news? The news.
All right, news, real news. Romance Writers of America files for bankruptcy. RWA had approximately 10,000 members before 2019, which supported the organization through membership fees. Membership dropped to about 3,000 post 2019 and continued to decline. Contracts with Marriott hotels to host annual conferences from 2018 through 2028 have left RWA financially strained, particularly due to said unsold room blocks. Attempts to terminate or amend these contracts in 2022 were unsuccessful, exacerbating the financial burden. RWA filed for bankruptcy, aiming to manage its debts while continuing to provide services. The organization owes approximately $3 million to hotels and around $75,000 in other debts, with plans to repay over 3 years. All employee positions have been eliminated. The organization faced significant controversies, including the suspension of author Courtney Milan in 2019 and the rescinding of an award in 2021 for a book with a controversial protagonist. These controversies related to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues contributed to the loss of members and subsequent financial difficulties. For all those who continuously ask me why I don't put together a conference, here you go.
I'm trying to understand why they
Yeah.
would sign a 10-year commitment. Like I've done a lot of conferences, even in the financial world. We used to host one every year, and like at best we would do maybe two to lock something in. But like 10 years, like they got stuck with COVID in the middle of that. That's probably really
that's what really hurt them. But that $3 million that they're on the hook for would have probably been closer to $20 million if they hadn't done such an extended deal. This is speculation for me. I don't have numbers. I don't have anything. But
that's true. Yeah, they probably got some really good rates.
Yeah.
They needed to find a cheap hotel chain or something, though, like a Red Roof Inn or something, because it sounds like
Motel 6. But yeah, I have mixed feelings about it, just because, this controversy has been going on forever, and there was all kinds of stuff that came out. And I don't know, there's always information you don't have. But, a lot of the authors that we've had on here, when I've asked them, where did you learn about the business, or how did you get your start? A lot of them pointed to the RWA. So it's always sad when, an organization that is there to help authors and to help with knowledge folds. I was really hoping they could repair their issues and keep going, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe this is something that can lead to, like, there's got to be a way to rethink and reimagine how conferences work, because I know a lot of people who organize and run these things now, and they all share some of the same problems. And the biggest is like getting these deals. The whole reason that the Author Nation conference is going to still be at that formerly Bally's, now Horseshoe Casino in Vegas, is because they're locked into a contract for like 6 years. So, there's got to be a better way to do this for flexibility's
Yeah.
sake.
ITW had a similar problem. I mean, they were in New York, but because of the number of people that attended, there were only, I think, 2 hotels that could actually handle. Well, 3. There was the Grand Hyatt, then there's the one they're actually using in Times Square, in the Waldorf. The Waldorf was crazy expensive. The Grand Hyatt closed. So they're kind of stuck. But
because I've actually never belonged to any clubs, any of these. Well, I mean, years ago I belonged to one club. It was a bad experience. It was like 10 albums for a penny, and I just never really financially recovered. But I mean, do you really find a lot of value in them in 2024? Is this something that you would recommend to people joining? Because I've looked at a couple of clubs to see if it was something I wanted to join. Is there value still?
I think there is for every new aspiring author in the beginning. For like I started off by going to the Writers Digest conference, and kind of worked my way up. And ITW, I went to Thriller Fest. I've been to BoucherCon, and I tended at the very beginning of my career, I picked up a little bit here, a little bit there, made a ton of contacts. I think that was my biggest takeaway out of any of it. The people I met and the relationships that I was able to cultivate. So I think from that standpoint, it's good. But all this information is out there on the internet. You can find it with the search. So I guess it all depends on what your ultimate goal is. But I do think there's something to be said for getting in a room full of other authors that are all kind of either at the same place you are, or a little above, a little below, or whatever, and helping each other out.
Yeah. All right, moving on to the next story. A hard but good ending for Polis Books. Jason Pintner announced the closure of Polis Books in March after 11 years in operation. The closure was driven by challenges from the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. About 50% of Polis's 171 titles were split between Bloodhound Books and Datura Books. 10% were rehomed through individual deals, while the remaining rights were returned to the authors.
More sad publishing news.
Yeah.
I mean, they did an awesome crime in print, and I'm very sad to see that fold.
I saw a couple authors online sort of questioning where my book's going to go. I don't know if there was a little bit before, but I guess there was some confusion on it. And no shade to Jason, who was running the place, because it sounds like he was trying to do his best on it.
Yeah.
But some of them did seem like they were kind of like, what's happening? So
Yeah.
my heart goes out to them.
I hate to see any publishing house fold, but there should be a contingency plan for what happens to the rights. I mean, that needs to be in place.
Yeah, you've got to be prepared for it, but in all honesty, it should be in your contracts. If you're going to negotiate a contract with anybody, get a clause in there that says those rights go back to you after, in my case, we typically have a certain amount of time, like they have to publish within X number of months. And if they don't, I get the rights back, which kind of covers you for any type of contingency. I mean, it's great that he's just returning the rights to the authors, but for all we know, those contracts don't actually specify that he could fold without actually doing anything. And if the contract doesn't have something in there and he folds without reverting the rights, another publisher is probably going to be standoffish as far as putting that book out there, because those rights might be up in the air, and if they're not free and clear, they may not want to touch it. So, I mean, just as an author, just protect yourself. Make sure you get a clause in your contract. This way you don't have to worry about it.
And the pandemic gets blamed for all of this too. I mean, I don't know if the pandemic sort of exposed some weaknesses in our industries, or is this actually shutting down industries? Because you hear that a lot, after the pandemic. Like there's some booksellers dropping like flies, but there's a kid on TikTok doing a hot or not channel making $100,000 a year. Yeah. So I'm not sure if the pandemic was something that is crushing industries, or is just sort of, laying them out to bear.
COVID gets a bad rap. It's the moral of the story.
There's your headline. COVID gets a bad rap. I like that.
Yeah. Well, it was nice knowing you, JD. All right. Next up, Costco plans to stop selling books year-round. This one does make me sad. Starting January 2025, Costco will stop selling books year-round. Books will only be stocked during the holiday shopping period from September through December. Costco's book orders are significant, often in terms of thousands of copies. The decision is expected to substantially impact book sales and hurt publishers. The labor required to stock books is a major factor in the decision. Unlike other products that can be rolled out on pallets, books must be laid out by hand. The frequent turnover of books with new releases every Tuesday and unsold books needing returns adds to the workload. Some of my earliest hardcovers came from not Costco, actually from Sam's Club, but same deal, So I I'm so sad to see this go.
It's a huge number of books they order. It just hurts. Like it's going to hurt the publishing industry to not have that contract.
I was on the flip side of this because my new book, it was distributed by Simon & Schuster. So Costco came in. I meant to go and look. I'm pretty sure it was 7,500 copies that they ordered for their stores. Now, the thing is, and if you've been in a Costco, they basically have a giant table. They, take those books out. They just spread them out on the table. They're not really in any kind of order. You just kind of pick through them, which is fun, if you're shopping for books. But, every week they go back through that same table. They pull out whatever doesn't sell and they send them back. So they create this big order. Then a lot of those books end up coming back, which ends up hurting the bottom line of the publisher and ultimately the author. Costco, Sam Club, they all kind of handle it the same way. Walmart and some of the bigger box stores are different. They also order very large numbers, but for the most part, they hold on to them. So if they don't sell them in that initial run on the bookshelves, a lot of times they'll throw them in a bargain bin. Barnes and Noble, for years had their discount hardcovers up at the front there. To me, that's the better model because, that table in Costco, it's near impossible to get discovered. Your books will be found there. But you only get like the 1 week of exposure, versus the downside of all those books possibly coming back. It's not worthwhile. So it's got its good and bad points.
So did you do that deal? Did you send them the 7,500 copies or is it too big of a risk?
Yeah, no, from my standpoint, if I had a choice in any of it, nobody told me that I had a choice. Like I just saw them,
Okay.
they appeared on,
going.
Yeah, they appeared on a spreadsheet. I mean, I think ultimately we shipped a little shy of 60,000 copies of the book to various places, them being the 7,000 to 8,000 of that number. I haven't seen any returns come back yet, but it's still early. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of returns coming back from Costco because I was warned about that at the get-go. Places like Costco are notoriously known in the publishing industry because of the large numbers that they place on the order side and the large numbers they ship back. So that in a lot of ways, this is sad if you're a reader, but I think it's going to right the ship a little bit on the publishing side and help deal with some of the numbers.
So the argument here was that it was costly because it was labor intensive putting all those books out.
Yeah, I mean, because Costco, their normal model, they roll everything out on a pallet. They cut the plastic away and that's it. But they keep that cost down because they don't have people stocking the shelves and unstocking the shelves and going back and forth. But in this case with books, they had to do that.
See, I was thinking about this. What they should do is, those sampler people they have on every aisle, they should combine the rolls and get those people selling the mini sausages and cheese and get those people to sell the books.
That's a good idea. Yeah, here's some cheese in a book.
Right in.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah. While you're munching on these pork cracklings, have you tried the new James Patterson book? See, that could be something.
Just hand people a book as they come
idea.
in. Tell them you should fan through this and read a little bit of it while you're shopping, and then they'll already have it in their cart. I think people don't do this right, man.
I'm going to volunteer at Costco to go do that. Just pass out books.
I think we should
do it.
Yeah, it's that. What, Christine? This better than any of us. It's that transference of ownership thing, right? Like once it's in their hand, they don't want to let it go, right? That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Do you know what they do here in New Zealand? And you're going to think I'm making this up. They do wine sampling. I don't know if they do it at Costco.
Yeah, they do that here.
But
they do it in Austin.
Yeah.
Oh, do it?
Yeah.
They do that in my grocery store.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah. Not in Costco. They just do it on the street. You pull up to a corner.
Just in Texas.
And there's this guy with
some wine.
a bottle in a bag, and he says, "Hey, you should try this. It's a good year.
Have a sip. Here's a quarter."
I need to get out of the house more.
All right. When you're writing a book, the first draft is the easy part. It's what comes after that hurts. The confusion, the self-doubt, questioning this, questioning that, trying to get feedback so you can feel confident making changes. It's a lot to handle. And that's why I'm delighted to say that this episode of the Writers Inc. podcast is sponsored by AutoCrit. One of the most value-packed memberships for any author, AutoCrit brings you an amazing suite of tools that can make it a breeze to plan, write, and edit your books all in one place. From start to finish, everything you need to produce a strong, confident story is at your fingertips. Get instant developmental feedback on plot, conflict, characters, themes, and more through the Story Analyzer. And edit each sentence to perfection with a complete interactive editing suite packed with reports and insights. And that's not to mention additional benefits like private community forums and live members-only support and writing sessions every single week. It's an incredible place to be for any writer. And listeners of the Writers Inc. podcast can take advantage of lifetime AutoCrit Pro membership for one single payment. That's right, no renewal fees. Head to autocrit.com/JD to get yourself a lifetime membership now. Big thanks to AutoCrit for sponsoring the show.
With that, JD, who is up this week?
This week we've got Carol LaHines. Carol's debut novel, Someday Everything Will All Make Sense, was a finalist for the Nielsen Prize for the first novel and American Fiction Award winner. She's back with a dark comedy called The Vixen Amber Holloway, which releases June 11th. So here she is, Carol LaHines.
Well, hello, Carol. Thank you for joining us on the Writers Inc.
Hello, Kevin. It's my pleasure to be here.
So we're going to be chatting about your book. There's a lot to talk to you about, actually. I'm looking forward to some of this, but the book is kind of exciting. I've been looking things over here. We're talking about The Vixen Amber Holloway, which is a great title.
Yes.
It almost tells the story all on its own, but let's talk a little bit about the book real quick. So
Sure.
is this your debut book, or
This is my second novel.
second novel?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
should have known that. So, this one's got it all. It's got murder and intrigue and here's the best part: an unreliable narrator, which I do want to talk to you about.
I mean, honestly, that was my draw into the book. As a writer, unreliable narrators are endlessly fascinating to me, because they have one agenda. They may not know their own agenda. They give off clues. And they say one story, the reader kind of senses the subtext at the same time. So for me, that's always fun as a writer when you can do that and play off the differing, perspectives, because people, we think we know what goes on in other people's heads, but
what do you think it is about an unreliable narrator, though? Like, why would we? Because it always feels like it should feel like a betrayal of the reader, like, oh, this person's telling this story and I don't know if I can trust a single syllable out of their mouth. But what is it that draws us in on these characters?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Nabokov is one of my favorite all-time writers, and he's kind of king of the unreliable narrator. So I sort of grew up with this in my head, and we kind of sense, even though that we know this person is kind of not being entirely truthful on one level, we kind of the reader sort of gets what's going on in the background at the same time. And it's that friction that I think it's definitely fascinating for me as a writer. And I think as a reader, it kind of creates an inherent suspense that, because and also, how much do we know of our own motivations, right? We don't always know what's propelling us. So
maybe we're the
I think, yeah. And I mean, for me, it's definitely fun as a writer. An unreliable narrator is going to gloss over some things. They're going to distort certain other facts. And you have to somehow convey to the reader, what's really going on. Some of that is through dialogue with other characters or characters that are perhaps not as complicated or flawed. And the picture, the jigsaw kind of starts falling into place for the reader. And that's part of the fun. Yeah.
What are some, because this is a technique that I think writers could benefit from learning and maybe putting into practice. So what are some techniques that you used to establish this unreliable narrator? And because trust is an important part of every book, right? So how do you maintain reader trust with
it's
an
that
unreliable
fine
narrator?
line, because for me the main thing was I wanted readers to both sympathize with her and kind of be repelled by her at the same time and hold those feelings simultaneously. I mean, that for me is the fun as a writer. But I do think that if we look at like traditional unreliable narrators, like Lolita is a big one, right? I mean, part of that, like Lolita, mine is a jailhouse confessional. So we already know from the get-go that she's in prison for whatever reason.
Right.
And she has her kind of agenda of explaining or justifying how she got there. So I think kind of the two timeline structure, which I think, like Gone Girl, like there's other books we can think of that fall along those lines, or that tell, another favorite of mine is The Collector, because it's, a story about like this creepy guy that basically confines this young girl in his house, against her will. And we have dueling first person narratives. So we're getting his version first, which is like, I'm really, he really has, like Humbert, he really has a certain amount of feeling for this girl. He doesn't really perceive what he's doing. On one level, he perceives it as wrong, but on another level, it's kind of, he glosses over that, and then later on, we get that like horrific story of the girl down there where, in her mind, she doesn't want to focus on what's going on to her. She's kind of thinking about her past and more pleasant things to just kind of survive, where she is. And so I think, whether it's a first person narrator or it's like different narrators telling different versions of the same story, I think, that's kind of an interesting setup for the reader. Yeah.
Even more intriguing, I think, if you've got multiple points of view, if everybody's unreliable, it's sort of like what, how do you navigate the story at that point? But
exactly. I mean, it's kind of part of our modern world. I mean, one of my backgrounds, is I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm very accustomed to this kind of adversarial, this is, one party's point of view, and this is the other party's. And they're completely, totally opposite. And when you regard them side by side, you kind of see these discrepancies, these frictions between the two narratives. It's inherently antagonistic, right? So I think I'm kind of accustomed to that, people writing things from a certain stance, from a certain, they're invested in telling a certain point of view.
Right.
And of the same facts, we can come up with our different versions of the facts. So I think that that's something that, it creates inherent suspense. And I think that's something as readers, definitely modern readers, like doing that.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up your background in law, because I definitely want to talk about how that influenced this book and your writing in general. That is something I'm sure I know what little work I've done in that arena, as I've worked for attorneys in the past, and I've done some legal writing, and everyone does have their own perspective, we'll say, which seems to color reality. And it's almost like sometimes the best perspective wins, especially in court of law. Like
it is true. I mean, that's, it kind of teaches you the importance of narrative and how you create the story that ends up being the story. Like the facts are kind of the raw material, but I mean, I will say for many years, I kind of kept law over here and writing over here, and writing was kind of like my escape from the law. And I realized at a certain point that they were kind of like intertwined more than I would want to admit, where, and I definitely like the way narrative is perceived in the law definitely kind of filtered over into my writing. And even, I kind of like to exploit even the documents of the law sometimes, like, indictments, depositions, things like that, because there's a kind of, there's a lot going on in the law, but there's like an absurdity on a certain level of the law, and this kind of arch language that we still employ, and this kind of formality to kind of distill the kind of banality of certain, even some like horrific, like if you look at a lot of criminal indictments or other things, that really bad stuff is going on, and it's kind of spoken of in this kind of weirdly arch language, kind of detached. And I think, the kind of language that certain systems employ is interesting to me. as a writer, whether it's like legal language or medical language or this kind of
Yeah.
jargony stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, well, first of all, I can't think of a single lawyer I know who isn't a good storyteller, by just sort of necessity.
Right.
But look at folks like Michael Crichton, his background in medicine, and James Rollins, his background in
Right. Right.
veterinary medicine. Drawing on that specialized knowledge is pretty handy, I think. So
Yeah.
what are some ways that your legal background have fed your fiction?
Well, I
Now that
definitely,
you're willing to.
yeah. Yeah. Now that, well, I realized that a certain, for a while I was really reluctant to write about lawyers at all, because I kind of had this sort of like didn't want cross contamination or
Yeah.
whatever. And then I realized, more that this was something, I could exploit both on the level, like you say, of crafting narrative, because, I work for an appellate court.
Okay.
So this is something we really see at that level because, when we see a narrative arrive and it's distilled for one thing, and it could have been going on for 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And we just have a record that basically distills everything that happened and one side's version of that and another side's. So that in like the starkest terms is kind of also what narrative is, right? We have, there's no one perspective on things that have transpired. And I think that understanding people's perceptual biases, psychological frameworks, all that kind of stuff, and how that influences how they understand what happened, even on the level of memory, right? Because, we've seen a lot lately how we now know that, eyewitness testimony is totally unreliable. And people think they see one thing, but it's really kind of they're bringing, all their prior experience to that. They're not. And even when they remember things, it's more of a process of active reconstruction,
Right.
So that's definitely something I wanted to do in this novel, where there's a good distance of 10 to 15 years between kind of the operative narrative and Ophelia, the main character, looking back on what happened.
Yeah.
So, and I think when people do that, they're kind of prone to seeing or remembering things the way they want to have remembered them, and not necessarily as they happened.
Right. Yeah. A good friend of mine who is a very accomplished attorney says that if you put 4 people on the stand, you'll get 6 different testimonies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's kind of, that element of it is of interest to me. And also how we kind of like, we package these like human tragedies in such weird way, like they arrive in a courtroom and like, is that really, that's what we call justice, but it's kind of an imperfect mechanism, and I do think people at the end of the day want to have their say, they want to have their piece, they want to, testify to what happened, how they think things happen. So I think it kind of plays into that kind of human need to do all of that.
Yeah.
And honestly, it seeing it actually, I feel like I learned a lot about just narrative reading about court cases, because they just have a certain format, template, whatever you want to call it, that things follow a certain course, they follow a certain narrative arc. So for me, that's something that's kind of easy to latch onto,
Yeah. Were there any court cases or anything that you were drawing from, like from the real world that influenced this book?
Not so directly, but I did have in mind, certain, like in New York, we had that famous case of the when I was a kid, of this socialite woman that had murdered her diet doctor lover. I don't know if you remember this. And that had been in the news for a while. I do. I think all those kind of lurid stories, that we hear about in the newspaper, that the participants in it, that they have their own kind of view of what really happened, and that's like, and the kind of outside perspective of what happened from the journalists is one level, and then the level of the people who lived through it. And I think that the whole conceit of having it told after the fact, kind of when Ophelia's in prison, is one of the things that appealed to me, as opposed to, because I also thought about telling it just straight chronologically.
Yeah.
But it would miss that friction of, because even her own narratives of what happened differ depending on the time frame.
Yeah.
And she's also seeing a psychologist. So what she tells the psychologist is kind of off from other parts in the book. So,
and that just intensifies that whole unreliable bit, right? Like because we all know the outcome. We all know she's sitting in a cell, so we know where it's headed. How are you able to kind of like, because the challenge to me would be, how do I keep people guessing? It's sort of that, like, if it's those stories where if the person is alive at the end of the story to tell it, then we know they didn't die during the story. So how do you keep that up?
Exactly. I mean, that's the why the whole element of the unreliable narration was so key to it, and why I had to find some way to pull it off, right? Because we know, like, you kind of, every piece of writing has its own inherent, set up constraints, whatever you want to call them, right? That we as writers dictate. And so, from the beginning, that was one of the risks of proceeding from telling it after the fact, right? So we know she's in prison, right? So as a writer, I kind of had to, I couldn't rely more on the crutch of, we just don't know what happened, because that's kind of more obvious crutch. But the why of how it happened and how it transpired in actuality is that's, I think, what propels the reader along. So it has to work on all those levels, because I did put myself in that box from the beginning. That
it's almost like the events themselves are kind of a red herring for the motive story. Like you're telling a story of motive, not necessarily facts, right?
Exactly.
That's pretty fascinating. But law isn't the only background you bring to this, right? You actually have a background in music, and that's informed this as well, right?
I think so. Perhaps not directly as directly as other parts of my writing in terms of subject matter, but I do feel like, because my first art form was music, and that's what I knew, I feel like I kind of rely a lot on musical concepts or technique almost as much as I do on narrative ones. That is to say, like, the rhythm and the tempo of the writing is really important to me. And I don't think it was something I ever consciously set out to do, but like fairly early on in my writing, one of my first mentors, said to me, you had to have been a musician. And I thought it was kind of, it took me aback a little bit, because I thought, how did he know that? But I think it's just kind of that the sense of timing and meter is just something that you kind of reflexively, it's just ingrained in you, so I think that's
well, what I was going to ask, what were some of the ways that came out in the writing? Like, how do you handle tempo and rhythm in on the page?
Well, I think it's kind of the sentence rhythm. I think there's a kind of like momentum to the sentences. I think also, like in music, or I play both jazz and classical, right? So I mean, certainly in jazz, there's this concept, like you have a melody, right? It's like a page long, and then everyone just improvises off it, so that this whole kind of concept of riffing off a theme or a melody or improvising is very ingrained in me. And I think that when I'm writing, I tend to kind of think that way. Like, this is the melodic line and I'm kind of riffing off it. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that this was all conscious, but I definitely think that I could kind of, after a number of years, see that, the effects of that.
Yeah. I thought you were going to tell me you write to a metronome. So I was going to
No,
be very impressed.
But I do write to music, though. I know a lot of people
Yeah.
don't like that.
Some people don't. I do. I mean, and mine
Yeah.
is typically jazz, or
Yeah.
like lo-fi, which is like modern day jazz, you know. So I get that. I can't write to things. I used to be able to write to things that had, you know, lyrics, but I can't do that anymore.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
don't
know why.
either. I mean, I write to things that are only instrumental, and it
Yeah.
could be jazz, or I actually kind of prefer, you know, string quartets or something where the instrumentation is a little pared down.
Yeah.
But I find like it really gets me kind of in a state where, you know, because I have definitely seen threads where writers are expressing things like, how can anybody write to music? My God, that's just so strange. That would be so weird for
Isn't
me.
that
I need
odd?
total silence, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's very odd to me. Given as, you know, I spent a lot of my career writing from random coffee shops and hotel lobbies and places where, you know, there was a lot more noise going on than music.
Yeah, the whole background hub's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, during the whole pandemic era, I was so starved for that I found channels on YouTube that play ambient coffee shop noises. So I would
Really?
literally play, yeah, I would
Yeah.
literally play noises from some randomly recorded coffee shop somewhere so that I could feel like I was out in the world. Uh, so that's interesting. All right. I want to talk a little bit then about like what your process is. Like,
Yeah.
let's get into the mechanics of this a little. Like, you know, what's a typical, because you have a day job, so you're not spending all day writing. Well, at least not writing fiction. So
Correct.
what does your writing time look like? How do you structure things?
I find I'm very, I think this comes from music too. I'm very regimented. You know, my
Yeah.
schedule is very set, and it's very ritualistic. And
Yeah.
I always, I mean, I write first thing in the morning. I mean, I might walk the
Yeah.
dog or have some coffee and read the
Right.
paper,
Right.
but I mean, basically, I'm writing first thing in the morning every day, regardless. Like, and I'm not, I'm a, I write well quickly in spurts, but I could not sit and write for like 4 hours. Like, that's just not, there's a point of diminishing returns for me. And it's kind of at this point, I know like I'm going to kind of go like this and peak at a certain point,
Right.
and then finish. And it's almost always the same amount of words every day. I mean, it's just something I'm used to doing. So, you know, I would say, but I probably from beginning to end, it's not more than like an hour and a half.
But it's a productive hour and a half. Like, it's not,
yeah, I mean,
you don't sit down and
find,
wonder, what should I put on the page? You sit down and you start writing.
well, because I write every day, it's not that far in my memory what I was writing last, but I will, depending on what I'm writing, you know, I will read over the most recent material. And sometimes if I'm like in the middle of a book, I will just go back and kind of flip through and spend half an hour reacquainting myself, because I want to see organically what is the thread in the narrative that I then pick up on, you know. And I know a lot of other people like to outline. I'm like very not an outliner, at least not in the first draft stage.
Yeah.
So I like to see, because I feel like there's always 4 or 5 threads going on there that you can pick up on. And sometimes, you know, my subconscious may know it, but I may not consciously remember it. So I sort of like to refamiliarize myself.
Yeah.
And then I'll just scribble a little notes about, you know, kind of where it could go that day. Nothing set in stone, but something that I just arrive at then. And then I start writing, and I try to do it quickly, just so that I don't have my conscious mind kind of overriding and over analyzing what I'm doing. Right. That's, for me, that's always a danger. So I try to just, you know, keep it moving. And the music helps with that. Yeah, exactly. And the music helps with that. And, you know, when you're playing, it's like, if you make a mistake, you just keep going. You don't go back and second guess, because you lose the whole momentum. So I try to just keep going, and then I will always edit that part the next day, but not then. I try to really separate my writing time from my editing time.
That's a good process. Yeah. Do you have like a word target or something you aim for each day, or is it?
I mean, I usually write probably it's usually about a page and a half every day.
Okay.
Is about what I get out.
Do you write by hand or do you type?
No.
Okay.
Like I use Word.
Yeah.
And I will just plow through the first draft, till I get to the end, like talking to nobody about it, because I've kind of learned the hard way that I don't want other influences in there until I get an entire draft out. At that point, I will, because a lot of times I write, things are definitely going on subconsciously, but you're not necessarily aware of how it's manifesting on the page. You have a certain amount of control over it, but there's a certain amount you don't really have control over. But it's kind of proceeding as a momentum. And so I don't like to interrupt that and just get to the end. And if it's not working, it's not working. If it is working, it needs to be edited. Like, all that can be done later, but it's really hard to go back and get into that state, you're in, like when you're writing the first draft. So
so you write. Is your process then that you write and then the next day you edit what you wrote, or do you?
I usually edit the immediately preceding day, just lightly, not, just so that I may tidy up some of the language. I don't like linger on it too long, but that way when I get to the end, it's not like, what the heck is going on? Like I've kind of been editing as I go along.
Right.
And that way, I make sure it minimizes the likelihood that it just goes completely off the rails because I wasn't, rereading what was going on before. Because any piece of writing has, multiple threads going on of where it could go, right? You don't want it to be so obvious where it's going, because then, where's the suspense for the reader? So I think it's fun to kind of see those going on, and then if it's heading in this direction, and the general direction, but you don't have the exact coordinates of where it's landing.
Right.
So, because I think sometimes when, at least for me, if I'm predetermined, then it's almost like I'm slavishly following that, and it doesn't allow for like kind of your imagination to enter in and go in that direction. So
well, believe it or not, we're at time, so we're gonna have to wrap up. But this has been great. You are not an unreliable narrator, so thank you for that. And how about where can people find? So the book is I'm going to read it off so that I don't mess it up, because I have a tendency to do that. But The Vixen Amber Holloway. Where can people find you and your work?
All right. So it's on pre-order now, and pre-order on all the platforms you would expect. Amazon, Regal House, the publisher, Bookshop, all of that. It's out June 11th. And you should, if it's not in your local bookstore, please ask them to carry it. That's always a good thing. And it should be available in your library or bookshop.
Excellent.
And after publication, I'm New York City based, so most of my events are around here, but now that we live in a Zoom world, pretty much appear anywhere. So I mean, that part is fun for sure.
Yeah. Those are grueling but fun. Those little junkets are kind of nice. So, and people can find you at CarolLaHines.com as well, right?
Yep.
In the book.
Yep, that's my website.
Excellent. Yep. All right. Well, thank you for chatting with us, and good luck.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay. Thank you so much. Take care.
So, this is the one that Christina and I both picked up on for sure, but have you ever used an unreliable narrator in any of your books?
I love them. I think Gone Girl was probably the most, well known, and that really started that whole trend. But I've got the diary entries in my 4MK series, which even as I wrote them, I wasn't sure that they were going to be, they should be considered reliable.
Yeah.
So the audience picked up on it quite a bit. Like, are these true? Are the stories not true? Now that I'm writing prequels to that series, I'm really, really playing off of that. And I'm having a ball with it, just taking little things that seemed like they were fact, little throwaway events and stuff that appear in the series and completely twisting that around into something else. And the only way I could do that is through the use of an unreliable narrator. So it's fun for me as an author. I think it's fun for readers to stumble through that kind of thing. I'm all for it.
I'm using an unreliable narrator in my autobiography. It's working out great.
I like what she talks about, using it to build suspense. And I can see how in thriller and suspense novels, that's what you do. I do a serial fiction serial. Hey, that was redundant, under a pen name. But the protag has ADHD, which may or not be modeled after the author. And so, he's totally unreliable because he's focusing on whatever, right? And his mind is everywhere. So you can't really trust him any of the time because his perspective is very different. So I think that's a fun way to do it too. Yeah.
My stuff is unreliable simply because I forgot what I wrote 6-7 chapters ago.
Name
and
changed.
It's just wrong.
Gender changed. Everything changed. Yeah.
I guess to some extent, anytime you have a first person POV, it's unreliable because, anytime somebody is writing from a, first person POV, it's how I'm interpreting that particular scenario. Because you ask two people about a scenario or person, you get two different ideas. So, but I always find them kind of fun to read on unreliable narrators. And now that I know that they're out there more increasingly, even if I'm reading a story that does not have an unreliable narrator, I'm constantly in the back of my head, oh, is this person full of crap? Is this person, So it kind of adds to even the books that don't include it.
I always think everyone is unreliable. I'm like, that person is the killer. I think everyone is the killer.
Yeah, right up until the end. Did any of you ever watch How I Met Your Mother? That show? No. Okay.
I watched it
I only know through the memes.
Without, I can't possibly spoil anything for you, really. But the one of the interesting theories.
Been out for a couple of years.
Yeah, it's been out for a while. But there's a theory that show has an unreliable narrator in the form of throughout the series, the main character Ted Mosby is narrating how he met his kid's mother, and they do flash forwards to him talking to his kids. Bob Saget is actually doing the voiceover for the whole thing. But the interesting theory is that all these quirky things that happened throughout the series, including his character Barney, played by Neil Patrick Harris, are actually all the result of Ted being an unreliable narrator for what actually did happen. Because some of these things are so over the top. So you get to the end of the series. So I'm seriously considering playing with that idea. I think that would be a great way. Like, you don't find out that the narrator is unreliable until you get to the ending. I think that would have the biggest impact.
Did that take away from any of the plot lines at all? Like, I think about, as you described, I think about Usual Suspects. We're sort of in the end. Big spoiler, Kevin Spacey did it. But like in the end, when you realize all of it isn't true, and so but some of it might be. Right. I mean, I still enjoyed that.
I think that you still get those elements. I think what you're having is a filter applied to it, right? So the events they're likely to still happen the way they happen, because even an unreliable narrator is going to get some of it right. It's more about like the meaning behind certain things, the nuance of things changes. Like what you thought was the motive of the killer is actually something else entirely. And so, I think because, if you think about it, and there's a little bit of this in I think Carol's book, but the idea of like the murderer telling the story, the way she's used to it as an attorney is, the person who's being prosecuted is giving their side of the story. They're going to give the facts as they see them or as they want you to see them. And so that does influence the direction of everything. So I think, I don't know, it's something to play with. I think it would be incredibly hard to pull off well, but I feel up to the
I'm
challenge.
going to date myself, but remember Primal Fear.
Yeah, Primal Fear.
Was a total unreliable narrator. And then at the end, you're like, oh my gosh.
That's
Okay.
Edward Norton, right? That was his first movie.
Yeah. It was a really good movie.
So I mentioned that Carol was an attorney. So she had said that for a time she was reluctant to write about lawyers, which is her specialized knowledge. For new and incoming writers, should their careers or their specialized knowledge be off limits, or should they learn to lean in on it?
Oh, I think you got to lean in, right? You know, like I talked to an agent yesterday who was at a conference recently that had one of those pitch elements, you know, where people are pitching their novels, trying to get an agent. And she said like 70% of the books that she got pitched were medical thrillers. But only like 2 of the people that pitched those books actually had a background, you know, in medicine. You know, like the book just doesn't come across as credible without that. I mean, you could write it, you know, for sure, but you'd have to do a ton of research. So I think it's so much easier to fall back on your background. I love that, you know, from a lawyer standpoint though, like that's a whole different dynamic because of what you guys kind of touched on. You know, you get 2 sides of the same story, right? You know, you've got the plaintiff, basically their side, then you've got the defense, their side. Then you've got the judge who rules in, you know, somewhere in the middle. But those are, you know, typically it's on paper, you see it in person. So she's exposed to, you know, an unreliable narrator as a career over and over again. And I think that really points out a lot of those differences. And I'm sure it helped her in the actual writing process.
Yeah. I always lean into.
I like the idea of taking the day job. I mean, because Kevin, you were a cop or are a cop?
No.
I mean, have you ever included? I thought you said you were a cop.
No,
I apologize.
He only hides from the cops.
No, no, I've never been a cop. My father was a police officer, but that's a whole other. There's a novel
that
there.
That explains a lot.
Yeah.
It really does.
Well, does it change anything that I didn't meet him until I was 38 years old? Miss Smarty Pants?
It does. It does.
Sorry, but go ahead, Dick. I don't want to spoil your point, but go ahead.
No, I was just asking about including that. You know, because I wrote one novel that was outside of the supernatural because I write supernatural humor, but I wrote one novel that was just about like the news industry.
Yeah.
And so I think in part that it was fun, but it was so sort of and there was a lot of stuff I sort of revealed in that, I guess, about the industry, but it was, it didn't do so well, I think in part because it was outside. I mean, I've had a lot of careers, like I've got a rock radio career, but I can't write about a lot of that stuff because the statute of limitations hasn't expired.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like you're saying, JD, I think that when you bring in some of your career, some of the stuff you have, they give some authenticity to you as an author. Like, I know what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you some of these secrets.
I do think there's a danger of the math teacher problem, though, which is math majors make the worst math teachers because they know it all so well. So you're getting this fire hose of insider information all the time, and they can't quite click with why you're not getting it. And I worry about that from a reader's perspective. If I'm going, because there's a lot of things that I've done, and I have, you know, my resume is eclectic, we'll say. But the you know, if I start going into great detail about any given thing that I have a lot of insider knowledge about, am I going to just, you know, drown the reader in things that they don't care about?
Yeah, you do have to be careful with that. I get lost in, you know, because I do brain stuff, and I can get real technical, and then I read that and I go like, oh my gosh, that reads like an academic paper, and then I have to cut that out, and you know, you have to put it in, but that's what I do at work a lot of the time anyways, because I give talks to people who are not in the field, so I have to put it in language that's not in the field. But yeah, I lean into mine hard. I love brain stuff. Brains are weird and wild, and I love all the stuff. And you know, I'm doing the brain computer interface stuff to help lovely children at school. And then, of course, when I write about it, it's like, what is the most nefarious thing I can do with this? So yeah, I think that's fun.
There is a cheat code out there if you want to get into somebody else's head, and that's read memoirs. And autobiographies, particularly if it's written in first person. You know, so if you're going to write a book about firemen, pick up a couple memoirs or autobiographies written by firemen, and you'll be inside their head. And I think you can pick up enough to be able to pull off the fiction novel. I've been doing that a lot lately, and I'm finding it extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Nice. That's a good tip.
Or just hang out with some of that crew. I mean, I wrote years ago 2/3 of a trilogy about a fire investigator, and I just rang up a firehouse in Marietta, Georgia. I said, "Can I come hang out?" And they had me come by,
Yeah.
and I hung out with them the afternoon. They made barbecue, which is an odd thing. You would think firefighters, of all things, would avoid barbecues, but they love them.
Oh
some
man, no,
barbecues.
they got the best barbecue, man. Those guys know.
But they're safe. They are safe barbecues.
They are safe
in an open
barbecues.
space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've done ride-alongs and things like that. So that's the
They're great.
Yeah. Do you guys ever use multiple viewpoints to tell the same story? Like, do you loop back and tell the same story with different POVs? No?
I think that'd be intriguing. That'd be fun. Is that something you do, Kevin?
I have done that in a couple of stories, but I don't know that it's something I would fall back on. But it is an interesting perspective. Like,
it's very, very difficult to do because if you have to make sure that you're moving the story forward. So if you hit the rewind button, for 3 different characters and kind of go over the same scenario over and over again, the readers are going to get lost. But I think there's definitely a way to do that where, your second POV kind of picks up where the first one left off. Maybe there's a little bit of overlap. It's possible to do, but I've read a couple where they try to do it and it just doesn't work well. It's very tricky.
Where I found some success with this, the advantage I had is the 2 characters in my Kane series, where one's just, she's a 25-year-old woman telling her story. She's a former criminal, and then the other character is a French-Canadian werewolf. And so there's such different perspectives. And so when they do actually sort of look at the same scene, one character will sort of, they're in a store somewhere and something happens. And then the other character, my main character, he goes through it. So we start to see some of what happened in the previous scene from the other narrator, and we see it from that other perspective. It's so different. They come from the same scene at such very different angles that hopefully it's somewhat entertaining. And so there's such different characters, though, I think it makes it fun.
Yeah. All right. We're running out of time. I am disappointed we didn't get to talk about lo-fi and coffee shop ambiance.
I know. I was so close to asking. That was going to be my next question.
Of which I am also a fan, Kevin.
Okay, good.
I do it too. So you're not the only stranger. And with that, JD, who is up next week?
Next week, we've got Kimberly Bell coming on. She's a USA Today and international bestselling author of suspense novels, including The Marriage Lie, which was a Goodreads Choice Award semifinalist for Best Mystery and Thriller. Her latest novel is called The Paris Window, about a dream vacation that turns deadly, and it releases June 11th.
Awesome. If you'd like to be notified as soon as new episodes publish, make sure you go to writersincpodcast.com and sign up now. We'll see you next episode and have a great week of writing.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Writers Inc. Access the show notes and leave a comment at writersincpodcast.com.